The sun had gone down and the land of New Mexico was painted in the colors of red, orange, and dark shadows. Dust hung in the air from the hooves of horses, and the sharp cries of men echoed across the dry hills. The Apache warrior, a young woman named Ayanna, gripped her spear with steady hands even though her heart was pounding like a drum in her chest. She was brave, trained since childhood to fight for her people. But that evening the battle had turned against her. A group of raiders had come, men greedy for cattle and land, and they had no mercy for the Apache who stood in their way. Ayanna's small band had fought hard, arrows flying, spears clashing, but the raiders were too many, and they carried rifles that spat fire and smoke. Horses screamed as bullets ripped through the air. She had tried to rally her people, but the tide of the fight was too strong. Ayanna's horse was struck by a bullet. The animal gave a terrible cry, reared, and collapsed, throwing her hard against the ground. Pain shot through her body as she rolled in the dirt, dust filling her mouth and stinging her eyes. She struggled to rise, clutching her side where blood soaked her clothing. The world spun and the sound of shouting grew fainter, swallowed by the desert night. She knew her people were scattering, some fleeing into the hills, some falling to the ground, never to rise again. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she crawled to a cluster of rocks. Her spear was gone, her bow broken, and only a small knife rested at her side. She pressed her back against the cold stone, trying to block the bleeding, but she could feel her strength slipping away. The stars above seemed to tremble and dance as her vision blurred. Memories filled her mind. She saw her father teaching her to ride bareback across the valley, her mother braiding her hair by the fire, the laughter of her younger brothers when they played near the river. She thought of the songs sung at night, the beat of the drums, the strength of her people. She had sworn to defend them, and now she was here, wounded and alone, the desert wind whispering like a farewell. Her lips moved in prayer, soft words asking the Great Spirit to guide her. She laid her head back against the stone and closed her eyes. She expected the darkness to swallow her completely, to drift into the silence of death. Hours passed. Coyotes howled in the distance and the cool night pressed down. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes hearing the rustle of dry grass, sometimes the echo of hoofbeats far away. She no longer cared. She had accepted her fate. But fate, as often happens in the wide land of the West, had other plans. At the first light of dawn, the land stirred awake. Birds began to call from the cottonwoods by the river, and the faint smell of water mixed with dust filled the air. A farmer named Samuel rode his old horse out to check the cattle near the edge of his land. He was a quiet man, known to his neighbors as someone who kept to himself. Years ago he had lost his wife, and ever since then he had lived with only his younger sister on their small farm. His life was simple: wake with the sun, tend the cattle, mend fences, and pray for rain when the land was too dry. That morning, Samuel had planned only to ride a short distance and make sure none of his cows had strayed. But as his horse trotted along the ridge, something caught his eye near the rocks. At first he thought it was a bundle of cloth or a dead animal. Then he saw the shape more clearly. A body. Samuel's heart jumped. He urged his horse closer and dismounted. The sight froze him where he stood. It was a young woman, her dark hair tangled, her face pale beneath the dust. She wore the clothing of an Apache, and her chest rose and fell faintly. She was alive, but barely. For a long moment Samuel stood in silence. He knew what it meant to find an Apache warrior wounded near his land. If neighbors discovered her, they would not show kindness. Many feared the Apache, spoke of them as enemies, and some men would not hesitate to end her life where she lay. He also knew that by helping her, he would be risking his own safety, maybe even his farm. But Samuel was not a cruel man. His wife had once told him that no life should be left to die alone if there was a chance to save it. Those words came back to him now, clear as day. He knelt down and touched her wrist. The pulse was weak, but still there. "Easy now," he whispered, though he knew she could not hear. With careful strength, Samuel lifted her into his arms. She stirred faintly, her eyes opening for just a moment. Dark, sharp eyes met his, full of fire even in weakness. She tried to push him away with what little strength she had, but her body failed her. She slipped back into unconsciousness. Samuel carried her to his horse, placed her across the saddle, and mounted carefully. His mind was full of worry. What if the raiders were still nearby? What if other settlers saw him? Still, he turned his horse toward home. The weight of the young woman pressed against him, a reminder that he was carrying more than just a body. He was carrying a choice, one that could change both of their lives. The ride back seemed longer than usual. The sun was higher now, casting golden light across the fields. His small farmhouse came into view, smoke rising gently from the chimney. His sister Mary was already outside feeding chickens when she saw him approach. Her eyes widened when she noticed the limp figure in his arms. "Samuel!" she cried. "Who is that?" Samuel dismounted and answered in a low, steady voice. "She's hurt. I found her near the river. She needs care." Mary stepped back, fear and worry on her face. "She's Apache. If the neighbors hear, they won't hear," Samuel cut in firmly. "We'll keep this quiet. She's a human being before anything else, and she's dying." Mary looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. She knew her brother well enough to understand there was no changing his mind once he had decided. Together, they carried the woman inside, laying her gently on Samuel's own bed. As Samuel cleaned the blood from her wounds and Mary brought fresh cloths and water, the house filled with a quiet tension. Outside, the land stretched wide and endless, holding its secrets. Inside, a new story had begun, one the Apache warrior never expected when she closed her eyes to die. The morning sun shone through the small window of Samuel's farmhouse, filling the room with soft light. The Apache woman lay still on the bed, her breathing uneven but stronger than it had been the night before. Samuel sat by her side with a cloth in his hand, carefully wiping the sweat from her forehead. His sister Mary moved quietly around the room, bringing more water from the well, boiling it, and cutting clean strips of cloth to use as bandages. The house smelled of herbs and smoke, the smell of healing mixed with the life of a farm. When Samuel had first carried her inside, Mary had been frightened. It was dangerous to shelter an Apache, especially a warrior. The neighbors were quick to judge, and men from the town would never understand. They might come with rifles and anger if they found out. But when Mary looked at the young woman's pale face, she could not turn away. She had always trusted Samuel's heart, and his calm voice had convinced her that this was the right thing to do. For the next hours, Samuel worked steadily. He washed the wound at her side, careful not to hurt her more. He saw the bullet had only grazed her, tearing flesh but not going deep enough to kill her outright. Still, the blood loss had weakened her badly. He cleaned the wound with boiled water, wrapped it with soft cloth, and hoped it would not become infected. Mary brewed a tea from willow bark and sage, something her mother had taught her years ago, and together they poured a little into the woman's mouth, drop by drop. As the day passed, the warrior stirred. Her lips moved faintly, whispering words in her own language. Samuel could not understand, but he knew she was calling out to someone. Perhaps her family, perhaps the spirits she believed in. He answered in a soft voice, "You're safe here. Rest." By the afternoon, she woke fully for a moment. Her eyes opened, dark and sharp, scanning the room quickly. When she saw Samuel leaning near her, she tried to sit up, but her body was too weak. Her hand reached for the knife she no longer had. Samuel raised his palms gently. "Easy," he said. "No one will harm you here." The warrior stared at him with suspicion. She recognized he was not one of her people. His skin was pale, his clothes rough from farm work, his hands large and calloused from years of handling tools. She wanted to ask why he had brought her here, but the English words were not easy for her. She fell back against the pillow, watching him with mistrust in her eyes. Mary brought in a bowl of broth, simple soup made from vegetables and a little chicken. She held a spoon to the woman's lips. At first, the warrior turned away, but hunger and weakness overcame her pride. She allowed Mary to feed her slowly, though her gaze never left Samuel, as if she feared he would betray her the moment she closed her eyes again. That night, Samuel sat by the fire while Mary mended a shirt. He rubbed his forehead with tired hands. "We have to keep this secret," he said in a low voice. "No one can know she's here." Mary nodded. "The neighbors are already restless. They talk about raids and stolen cattle. If they hear we've taken in an Apache, they'll think we've lost our senses." Samuel looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "Let them talk. I couldn't leave her to die. Whatever happens, I'll carry the blame." Mary sighed. She had lived beside her brother long enough to know his stubborn ways. His heart was good, but his choices were heavy. Still, she admired him for it. Not many men would risk so much for a stranger. The next few days were slow and filled with work. Samuel rose early to check the cattle, fix fences, and carry water, but he always returned to the house to look after their guest. The woman's strength began to return. She could sit up, though moving caused her pain. She said little, mostly watching in silence as Mary worked or as Samuel came and went. One morning, Samuel brought in a small piece of bread and placed it on the table beside her. He pointed to it and said, "Bread." He repeated the word slowly, waiting for her to understand. The woman frowned, then repeated softly, "Bread." Her voice was low, uncertain. Samuel gave a small smile. "Yes, bread." Each day after that, he tried to teach her a word or two. Water. Fire. Horse. Sometimes she ignored him, but sometimes she whispered the word back, her pride hidden behind careful eyes. Slowly, a bridge began to form between them, made of small words and gestures. Yet the danger outside the farmhouse walls grew heavier. In the town, men were speaking of Apache raids. Some cattle had gone missing, and blame was quick to fall on the native tribes. A group of ranchers gathered one evening at the trading post, saying they needed to ride out and deal with the problem before it grew worse. Samuel heard the talk when he went to buy salt and flour. He kept his head down and said nothing, but inside his worry deepened. That evening, as he rode home, he saw dust rising on the horizon. A group of men were moving in the distance, rifles strapped to their saddles. He urged his horse faster, praying they would not come near his land. Back at the farmhouse, the warrior felt the tension too. She could not speak much English, but she understood fear. She could see it in Samuel's careful movements, in Mary's nervous glances toward the window. She also felt the pull of her own people, the longing to return to them, but her body was not ready. Each time she tried to stand, pain drove her back to the bed. Late one night, when the house was quiet and the only sound was the crackle of the fire, she opened her eyes and found Samuel sitting near her again. He was half asleep in the chair, his head resting on his hand. For the first time, she looked at him not as an enemy, but as a man who had kept her alive. Her thoughts turned to the moment she had closed her eyes among the rocks, certain she would never open them again. Yet here she was under a roof, her wounds cared for, her life not ended but changed. She did not understand why this farmer risked so much, but she felt something stir in her heart, something like gratitude, though she would not speak it aloud. The days stretched into weeks. Her strength returned slowly, enough that she could walk across the room with Mary's help. She began to eat more, to sit outside in the fresh air when the sun was warm. Samuel never asked her for thanks, never demanded she explain who she was or where she came from. He simply worked, cared, and kept her safe. But even as healing wrapped around her like a blanket, a shadow lingered. The neighbors were growing restless. Their eyes watched Samuel's farm too closely, and whispers were spreading. Someone had seen him ride home that morning weeks ago with a figure across his saddle. It would not be long before questions came knocking at his door. The warrior knew it too, and though her body was healing, her heart began to wonder. Was she truly safe in this farmer's care, or had her journey only just begun? The wind whistled across the open fields as another week passed on Samuel's farm. The days were long and hot, and the work outside never seemed to end. Yet inside the farmhouse, something unusual was happening. The Apache warrior, Ayanna, was slowly regaining her strength. Each morning she could sit up with less pain, and by afternoon she managed to take slow steps across the wooden floor. The scars of her wound were still tender, but her spirit was returning. Samuel noticed how her eyes followed every sound, every movement. She was alert, like someone always ready for danger. She rarely smiled, but when Mary offered her warm broth or tea, her eyes softened as though she was beginning to trust a little. Even so, the room carried tension. The warrior did not forget that she was in the home of a white man, and Samuel did not forget that neighbors might soon grow suspicious of the secret they were keeping. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in fire, Ayanna woke to find herself alone in the house. Samuel was outside chopping wood, and Mary was tending the chickens. The room felt strange in its silence. She rose slowly, leaning against the table for balance, and walked toward the window. She looked out at the farmer, sweat shining on his brow as he lifted the axe again and again. His movements were strong, steady, like the rhythm of the land itself. Something stirred in her chest. She remembered her own father, working with equal strength when shaping bows or carrying water. She realized that although Samuel was not of her people, he was also tied to the earth, bound by duty, and driven by quiet strength. When Samuel came inside later, he found her standing near the window. She quickly stepped back, embarrassed to be caught watching. He set the wood by the fireplace and offered her a cup of water. She hesitated, then took it. For the first time, her lips moved to form words she had practiced softly when he was not near. "Thank you," she said slowly. Samuel froze for a moment, surprised. Then he gave a small, genuine smile. "You're welcome." That night by the fire, Samuel decided to teach her more. He pointed at the chair. "Chair," she repeated. He pointed at the fire. "Fire," she repeated again, her voice more confident this time. Mary watched quietly, her needlework in her hands, but she smiled too. A bond was beginning to grow, fragile but real. Still, the outside world pressed in. Trouble was near. In town, men were restless. Talk of Apache raids filled the air, and anger ran like fire through dry grass. Samuel heard it when he went to buy supplies. Men gathered in small groups, whispering, pointing, questioning. One rancher claimed he saw Samuel riding weeks ago with something across his saddle. Another muttered that Samuel was too quiet these days, that maybe he was hiding something. Samuel kept his face calm, answering little, but his heart tightened. On the ride home, he looked over his shoulder more than once, half expecting men to follow him. The dust on the road felt heavier, the sky above more watchful. Back at the farmhouse, Ayanna felt it too. She had grown up listening to the land, to the whispers of danger carried on the wind. Now she sensed unease. She asked Samuel, her words broken but clear. "Men, come?" Samuel nodded slowly. "They might." For the first time, her dark eyes showed fear, not for herself but for him and his sister. She knew that if the townsfolk came and found her here, they would not spare Samuel either. She pressed her hand over her healing wound, torn between staying and leaving. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters, Ayanna could not sleep. She sat awake by the window watching the stars. Samuel, too, was awake, sitting quietly by the fire. Finally she spoke, her English halting but strong enough to carry her meaning. "Why, help me?" Samuel looked at her across the firelight. He thought of his wife, long gone, and the promise he once made to her about never turning away from someone in need. His voice was low but steady. "Because it was right. I couldn't leave you to die." She studied him, her face unreadable. In her world, kindness from outsiders was rare. She wanted to believe him, but her heart still wrestled with caution. Yet something inside her shifted. She no longer saw him only as a stranger. He had chosen to risk much for her, and that choice was not easily forgotten. The following days brought more small steps of trust. Ayanna began to help in little ways. She carried water from the well, though she still tired quickly. She fed the chickens with Mary, who showed her how to scatter seed. Once, Samuel caught her humming a soft tune from her people as she worked. The sound filled the air with a gentle strength, and though he did not understand the words, it touched him deeply. But peace never lasted long in the Wild West. One afternoon, as Samuel fixed a broken fence post, he saw dust rising in the distance. A group of riders approached, their figures sharp against the horizon. His stomach knotted. He knew who it was before they came close, the ranchers. They rode up with hard eyes and rifles resting easy in their hands. Their leader, a man named Briggs, called out, "Samuel, word's spreading you've been hiding something. Folks saw you bring someone back weeks ago. We don't take kindly to Apaches around here." "Better not be true." Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow and stood tall. "I've got nothing to hide but hard work. You all know me." Briggs narrowed his eyes. "We'll see about that. Men like you can lose land if they make the wrong friends." He spat in the dirt, then turned his horse. "We'll be watching." The riders left, but their shadows remained. Samuel felt the weight of their threat. Inside the house, Ayanna had heard every word. Her fists clenched, her pride burning. She hated feeling like a burden, hated that Samuel was in danger because of her. Yet when she looked at him, she saw no regret in his face, only quiet resolve. That evening, as the fire crackled low, Ayanna sat across from him. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I fight." "Beside you." Samuel met her eyes. In that moment, he realized she was no longer just a guest in his house. She was a warrior still, proud and strong, willing to stand with him against whatever came. The farmhouse walls were thin, and the world outside was growing hostile, but inside a bond was forming, fragile but unbreakable. Neither of them knew what the next days would bring, but they both understood one truth. Their lives were now tied together, and neither would face the storm alone. The days rolled on, and the air around the farmhouse grew heavier with each sunrise. The Apache warrior, Ayanna, was stronger now. She could walk without leaning on the table, and she spent time outside, breathing in the wide sky and feeling the sun on her skin. Yet every step she took, every glance toward the horizon reminded her that she was still caught between two worlds. Her heart belonged to her people, but her body healed under the roof of a farmer who had risked everything to save her. Samuel worked harder than ever, his hands rough with splinters and dirt. He checked the fences, watered the crops, and carried hay to the cattle, but his eyes always searched the road. He knew the ranchers hadn't forgotten. Their leader, Briggs, had made his warning clear. Samuel's quiet farm was no longer just his own business. It had become a subject of gossip, suspicion, and anger. Mary tried to keep the peace inside the house. She sewed new bandages for Ayanna, taught her small English words, and sometimes even laughed softly when Ayanna made mistakes, but corrected herself with a proud tilt of her chin. Mary, too, felt the weight of fear, but she also felt a strange warmth in the house. For the first time in years, the farmhouse was alive again, as though the arrival of the warrior had given new meaning to their quiet lives. But peace was fragile. One afternoon when Samuel was in town to buy flour and nails, two men stopped him outside the store. Briggs stood among them, his hat low over his eyes, his voice sharp. "You've been keeping to yourself, Samuel. Folks are talking. Some say they've seen shadows moving around your place that don't belong." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I keep to my own land. If folks want to gossip, let them." Briggs leaned close. "We don't need more trouble in this country. If you're sheltering one of them, you're asking for it. The town won't stand by." Samuel said nothing more. He loaded his supplies, mounted his horse, and rode home. But the words followed him like wolves snapping at his heels. When he returned, Ayanna noticed the shadow in his face. She asked in her broken English, "Men, angry?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, they don't understand." Her eyes darkened. She hated that he carried this burden because of her. She had grown up knowing mistrust between her people and settlers, but here was a man willing to stand against his own kind for her sake. Pride burned in her chest mixed with guilt. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Ayanna made a choice. She took Samuel's rifle from the wall and held it firmly. "I fight with you," she said. Her voice, though accented, carried no hesitation. Samuel's eyes widened. "You don't need to—" She cut him off with a sharp look. "I fight, not hide." He studied her for a long moment. In her face he saw not just a wounded woman, but the warrior she had always been. Slowly he nodded. "Then we'll stand together." The following days she began to train again. Her wound still ached, but she forced herself to move, to practice with the knife Samuel gave her, to aim the rifle with steady hands. Out in the yard she showed him how her people moved silently, how they listened to the land. Samuel, in turn, showed her how he repaired fences, how he set traps for coyotes, how he worked with the cattle. Bit by bit they learned from each other. Mary watched from the doorway, a strange mix of worry and hope in her heart. She saw the bond forming between them, a bond not born of words but of respect and shared struggle. But the whispers from town grew louder. A neighbor came one morning, pretending to borrow a tool, but his eyes wandered too much, scanning the house, the barn, the yard. Mary kept her hand steady as she offered him the tool, but her stomach twisted. When he left, she told Samuel, "They're watching us closer." That night, Samuel gathered Mary and Ayanna at the table. His voice was steady but serious. "They'll come again, and not just to talk. We have to be ready." Ayanna met his gaze, her chin lifted. "We ready." It did not take long. A few nights later, the sound of horses thundered across the quiet land. Samuel woke first, hearing the distant hooves. He rushed to the window and saw lanterns bobbing in the dark. Men were coming, and they were coming fast. He grabbed his rifle and turned to Ayanna. She was already standing, knife at her side, her face calm but fierce. Mary's hands shook as she held a lantern. "What will they do?" she whispered. Samuel's voice was low. "They'll try to take her, and maybe take the farm too." The riders drew near, their voices harsh in the night. Briggs called out, "Samuel, we know she's in there. Hand her over and no harm comes to you." Ayanna's fists clenched. She stepped toward the door, ready to face them, but Samuel caught her arm. "Not yet. He moved to the window and shouted back, "No one here belongs to you, Briggs." "Ride on." Laughter erupted outside. "Then we'll take a look for ourselves." Samuel cocked his rifle, the sound loud in the quiet night. "Step onto this land and you'll regret it." The standoff hung heavy in the air. Ayanna moved to another window, her eyes sharp, watching every shadow. She held the second rifle Samuel had given her, her body steady despite the ache in her side. For the first time since the battle weeks ago, she felt alive again, her spirit blazing with the fire of her ancestors. The men circled, trying to find a way to frighten Samuel into surrender, but they hadn't expected to see the glow of another rifle barrel shining from the side window. Ayanna, standing strong, her gaze unshakable. Briggs cursed under his breath. He realized this wasn't going to be easy. "You're making a mistake, Samuel. You'll lose everything for her." Samuel's reply came firm and unyielding. "Better to lose land than lose my soul." Silence fell. For a moment, only the crickets sang. Then Briggs spat again and turned his horse. "This ain't over," he growled. The riders pulled back, disappearing into the night, their threat lingering like smoke. Inside the farmhouse, the fire burned low, but the air pulsed with something new. Samuel lowered his rifle and looked at Ayanna. She lowered hers too, their eyes meeting across the room. In that moment, words weren't needed. They had stood together side by side and refused to bend. Mary set the lantern on the table, her hands still trembling. "They'll come again," she whispered. "Yes," Samuel said. "But now they know we're not afraid." Ayanna sat down slowly, the weight of the night pressing on her, but her spirit unbroken. For the first time since she had closed her eyes to die in the desert, she felt not only alive but part of something larger than herself. A new path was forming, one she had never imagined, and it began here in the farmhouse of a man who had chosen her life over his safety. The night passed in silence after that, but none of them slept deeply. They knew the world outside had grown darker. Yet within those walls a light burned, a bond of trust, of courage, and of something deeper that none of them could yet name. The morning came quiet, with soft light spilling across the fields and the smell of fresh earth in the air. The farmhouse stood strong, but all three inside felt the weight of what had happened the night before. The Apache warrior Ayanna sat on the porch, her dark eyes scanning the horizon. She was stronger than she had been in weeks, and every movement showed it. The battle had reminded her that danger was always near in this land. Yet it had also shown her something she had not expected. She could trust these people who had chosen to save her. Samuel moved about the yard, feeding the cattle and fixing a loose fence. Each time he glanced at her, he felt a quiet pride. She had healed, she had faced danger without fear, and she had chosen to stand with him rather than run back to the desert where her life had been in constant danger. Mary was busy in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, but her eyes kept flicking to Ayanna, watching the careful balance of trust and pride in the warrior's movements. The days that followed were tense but peaceful. The town had not returned immediately, but everyone knew that the rancher's anger had not faded. Samuel had to be cautious, yet he continued his work openly, refusing to hide what he had done. Ayanna helped where she could, carrying water, gathering eggs, and slowly learning to move confidently through the house. She observed everything, her sharp mind taking in the rhythms of farm life, the patterns of the land, and the quiet courage of the man who had saved her. One afternoon, as the sun beat down and the wind carried the smell of hay and dry soil, a rider appeared on the horizon. The woman froze for a moment, hand instinctively moving toward the knife at her belt. Samuel noticed her hesitation and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Easy," he whispered. "Just watch." The rider came closer, and Ayanna could see it was not a man from the town. Instead, it was an Apache messenger, someone from her own people bringing word of scattered bands and the dangers that still lingered in the desert. She felt her heart tighten. She had to decide: return to her people, follow the call of her home, or stay with the farmer who had saved her. The messenger stopped at the edge of the property and raised a hand in greeting. Samuel stepped forward carefully, not wanting to startle him, and Ayanna approached slowly. She listened to the words, nodding slightly, but her gaze returned to Samuel. He watched her quietly, sensing her conflict. That night, by the fire, Ayanna spoke softly. "My people. They call me back, but I stay." Samuel looked at her, surprised but relieved. "You don't have to explain to me," he said. "You choose your path," Ayanna nodded. "You're home." "You saved me, belong here now." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. She had given herself a second chance at life, choosing not to return to the endless battles and danger of the desert, but to remain in a place where she could heal and live fully. Samuel felt a deep respect for her strength, and Mary felt a quiet joy. The house that had been quiet and lonely for years was now full of new life. As the weeks turned into months, Ayanna integrated herself into the rhythm of farm life. She rose early with Samuel, worked in the fields, and helped Mary with chores. At times, she would tell stories of her people, teaching Samuel and Mary small words in her language, or sharing the traditions and songs of her tribe. Samuel listened, fascinated, and sometimes he joined her in learning the rhythms of the songs. Mary often laughed softly when they mispronounced words or got the rhythm wrong, but the house was alive with warmth and trust. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with streaks of orange and purple, Ayanna and Samuel stood outside watching the horizon. The air was warm, carrying the scents of the earth, the hay, and the distant river. She looked at him and said softly, "I never thought I'd live again like this. I never thought I'd feel safe." Samuel smiled. "You deserve it, and we'll protect it, together." Her gaze wandered to the land, to the fields stretching endlessly, and she realized how much she had grown attached to it. It was not her desert home, but it was a home of trust, courage, and second chances. She had come to see that bravery was not only in battle, it was in choosing life, in choosing to trust, and in standing beside someone else when danger approached. The legend of the warrior who had fallen and been saved by a humble farmer quietly began to spread. Travelers who passed the farmhouse whispered of the strange bond between the Apache woman and the farmer. Some said it was courage, some said it was fate, but all agreed it was a story of hope in a harsh land. Time moved on. Ayanna's scars faded, though the memories remained. She could still hear the echoes of the battle in her mind, but they no longer brought despair. Instead, they reminded her of the choice she had made, and of the man who had given her a second chance. Samuel continued his quiet life, tending his land, raising his cattle, and watching the stars with Ayanna by his side. Mary joined in sometimes, laughing at small mistakes or sharing stories from the town. Together they formed an unusual family, bound by courage, trust, and shared survival. One quiet morning as they stood at the edge of the field, Ayanna lifted her eyes to the horizon. The desert beyond was still wild and untamed, but she no longer felt the pull to return to it. She had found something new, a life full of hope, warmth, and safety. Samuel's hand brushed hers, a silent promise that whatever came, they would face it together. The Wild West was a place of danger, of open skies and open hearts, of battles fought and lives changed. Ayanna had come to the end of her path once, ready to give up, but the land, the people, and the kindness of one man had given her another chance. She had closed her eyes to die, but she had woken to life, to trust, and to the quiet magic of human courage. And in the farmhouse on the edge of the hills, the Apache warrior smiled for the first time in many weeks. She had survived, she had healed, and she had chosen a new life, not only for herself but for the people who had risked everything to protect her. In the wide, wild land of the West, sometimes fate was cruel, but sometimes it was kind enough to give second chances, and she had taken hers with strength, pride, and gratitude.